He built that house with his own hands. His daughter sold it. In 30 years on this bench, I have heard a lot of painful things. I have heard people lie about money, betray their business partners, abandon their obligations, and look me in the eye while doing it. I have developed, out of necessity, a certain professional distance from the cruelty people are capable of. But when a 92-year-old man sat down in my courtroom, placed a worn leather hat on the table in front of him, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "She took my home, the one I built with my own hands," I felt that distance close. Not collapse, close, the way a door closes when the wind changes. His name was Walter. He had built his house in 1957 after returning from Korea. He had raised his daughter in it. He had buried his wife from the front porch of it. He had tended the garden his wife planted every single day since she passed. The woman who evicted him was his only child. She sat across from him in a blazer that cost more than his monthly pension, arms folded, expression composed, waiting for this to be over. I want to tell you what happened that day, because the story is not really about fraud or forgery or property transfers, though it involves all of those things. It is about something older and sadder than any legal category. It is about a father who loved his daughter without condition, and a daughter who forgot what that meant. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because every week I sit here and tell you the truth about what I have seen. The cases that reminded me why this work still matters after all these years. This one reminded me more than most. Walter Hayes had lived in the same house for 67 years. He had poured the foundation himself in the summer of 1957 with 2 friends from his unit and a borrowed concrete mixer. He had framed the walls, hung the doors, built the porch steps from wood he milled himself. He was 26 years old and had come home from the war with steady hands, a clear purpose, and a woman named Ruth who had waited for him. He and Ruth had a daughter, Diane, born in 1962. Walter used to say she was the best thing he and Ruth ever made, and he said it often enough that Diane grew up knowing she was loved. The neighborhood around the house changed over the decades. Businesses came and went. Families moved in and out. But Walter's house stayed the same. The same cream-colored paint, the same wooden porch where he drank his morning coffee, the same garden along the south wall where Ruth had planted roses in 1964, and Walter had tended them every year since she died. He was 92 years old. He walked slowly and needed a cane on bad days, but he was sharp. His neighbors told me later that he could still beat anyone in the neighborhood at chess, and that he read 2 newspapers a day, cover to cover. He had one recurring health issue, a heart condition that had sent him to the hospital twice in the past 3 years. Each time, Diane had appeared briefly, made some phone calls, consulted with doctors, and then returned to her life in another city. She was successful, a real estate developer. She wore her ambition like jewelry. The last time Walter was hospitalized, he was there for 11 days with pneumonia. Diane visited on the 2nd day. She brought paperwork. She told her father it was a renovation agreement. She said she wanted to update the house for him, make it easier to navigate, add a walk-in shower and better lighting. She told him she had consulted a lawyer and everything was in order. Walter told me later that he hesitated before signing. He said he looked at the papers and didn't fully understand them. And he told me he almost asked to have someone else look at them first. But Diane was his daughter. She kissed his forehead. She said, "Trust me, Daddy, I just want to take care of you." So he signed. He came home from the hospital 10 days later to find a notice on his front door. The notice informed him that the property had been transferred into his daughter's name, that a mortgage had been taken out against it, and that he was required to vacate within 30 days. He stood on the porch he had built 67 years ago and read that notice 3 times. Then he sat down on the porch steps, placed his hat in his lap, and waited for someone to tell him it was a mistake. Nobody came. The case reached my desk through the standard process. I read the file the evening before. Within 20 minutes, I had questions. The property transfer documents were dated during Walter's hospital stay. The signature on the transfer form did not quite match Walter's signature on the other documents in the file. I am not a handwriting analyst, but I have reviewed enough signatures over 3 decades to notice when something is off. The letters were too smooth, too controlled. The signature of a man in his 90s, signing a document he understood to be important, carries a certain weight in the pen. This one did not. The renovation agreement Diane had brought to the hospital referenced work to be done on a property that, by the time the agreement was signed, had already been transferred into Diane's name, which meant there was no renovation. There was only a pretext for a signature. I also noted that Walter's monthly pension, direct deposited to an account that had been linked to the property for years, had been redirected 2 months earlier. The new destination account was registered to a business entity in Diane's name. I set the file down. I have seen financial exploitation of the elderly before. It is not rare. It is, in fact, more common than most people want to believe. And the perpetrators are more often family members than strangers. People assume that love is a protection against this kind of harm. It isn't always. I went to bed that night thinking about Walter sitting on those porch steps. He arrived the next morning in a dark suit that had been carefully pressed. It was an old suit, the kind kept for serious occasions. I learned later it was the suit he had worn to Ruth's funeral. He moved slowly through the courtroom, one hand on his cane, the other hanging steady at his side. He did not look around at the audience or the cameras. He walked to the plaintiff's table, placed his hat on the surface, and sat down. He looked at me with an expression I have seen many times in this courtroom. Not anger, not hope exactly, something quieter than either. The expression of a person who has been waiting a long time to be heard and is not entirely certain they will be. I gave him a small nod. He returned it. Diane came in behind him. She was dressed precisely, every detail considered. She carried herself with the ease of someone who has never genuinely feared a consequence. She glanced at her father once, briefly, the way you glance at furniture in a room you're considering redecorating. Then she turned her attention to arranging her documents. I watched her settle in. Then I called the session to order. "Ms. Hayes," I said, "let's start with the renovation agreement. Tell me about it." She smiled, the smile of someone who has prepared a story and is confident in it. "Your Honor, my father has some memory difficulties. I was concerned about his safety in the house. I arranged for renovations, updated the property into my name temporarily so contractors could work without complications, and provided him with a stipend to stay somewhere comfortable during the work." "Temporarily," I said. "That was always the plan. When was the house going to be returned to him?" A small pause. "We hadn't set a specific date. I wanted to make sure the work was complete." "I see." I turned a page. "The renovation work. Can you provide the contractor's name, the permits, the materials list?" Another pause. Slightly longer. "I'm still in the planning stages." "You transferred the property 8 months ago," I said, "and you're still in the planning stages of the renovation." She started to respond. I raised a hand. "I'd like you to look at something." I held up the renovation agreement. This document was notarized on March the 7th, but this signature here in the lower right corner was added after the notarization. I can tell because the ink sits differently on the page and the pen pressure changes in a way that is inconsistent with the rest of the document. I set it down. That means this document was altered after it was certified. Do you know what we call that? Diane's composure held, but barely. Her eyes moved to her lawyer in the gallery. "Your Honor, my father has dementia. He doesn't always remember what he signed or when." "Don't." The word came out quietly, but it stopped her completely. "Do not use your father's age as a defense for forging his signature." The room was very still. I want to tell you about the moment that changed the temperature of that courtroom entirely. It was not the forgery finding. It was not the redirected pension, though that came out shortly after, and the audience responded to it with an audible, collective sound, the sound of people absorbing something genuinely ugly. It was a much smaller moment, Walter's caregiver, a woman named Rosa who had tended to him for the past 4 years, had come to court with him. She was seated in the front row of the gallery. She was not a party to the case. She had simply come because she wanted to be there for him. At one point, when Diane was speaking, Rosa leaned forward slightly, and Walter, without looking at her, reached over and patted her hand once, a small, automatic gesture, the gesture of someone who has been comforted by another person enough times that the comfort passes between them without thought. I noticed it from the bench. It told me something important about the past several years of Walter's life. Who had been there? Who hadn't? I turned to Diane. When your father was hospitalized for 11 days in November, how many times did you visit? She straightened slightly.
I was there.
How many times?
I came as soon as I heard.
That's not what I asked. A pause.
Once.
She said. Once in 11 days.
I have a business to run.
I looked at her for a long moment without speaking. That silence, in my courtroom, is not neutral. Everyone who has watched this show for more than a week knows what it means. Does your father know you listed the property for sale 3 weeks after the transfer? Walter's head came up slowly. Diane's lips pressed together. The listing was under a business name, I said, but your signature is on the seller's authorization. You were not planning renovations. You were planning a sale, and the pension redirect was not an error. It was income you were collecting while your father was living on whatever Rosa and his neighbors could provide. Rosa, in the front row, closed her eyes briefly. Walter was looking at his daughter. He did not look angry. He looked the way people look when something they already knew somewhere deep inside has finally been spoken out loud. A kind of exhausted confirmation. Diane, he said softly, not to me, to her. Why? She did not answer. I have asked myself since that morning whether there is any version of this story where Diane is more than simply a person who chose greed over her father. I try to extend that kind of consideration to everyone who comes before me. People are complicated. Relationships between parents and children carry decades of history that a courtroom cannot fully hold. There are disappointments and resentments and old wounds that sometimes calcify into something unrecognizable. I don't know what happened between Walter and Diane over the years. I only know what I saw in front of me. What I saw was a 92-year-old man who had signed a document because his daughter asked him to trust her, who had come home from the hospital to an eviction notice, who had sat on the porch steps he built with his own hands and waited for someone to tell him it was a mistake. And across from him, a woman who had every advantage in that room: money, a lawyer, a prepared story, and professional composure, and who used all of it to defend taking her father's home. At one point, I asked her a question I do not ask often. Ms. Hayes, your mother, do you remember what she would have thought of this? The composure cracked, just slightly. Something moved across her face that I don't think she expected to feel in that room. She did not answer. I did not ask her again. The ruling was clear. The property transfer was invalidated on grounds of fraud and undue influence. The forged document was referred to the county district attorney's office. The redirected pension payments were ordered returned in full with interest. The house was Walter's. When I announced that, the courtroom applauded. I usually stop applause. That day I let it run for a moment before I called for order, because sometimes a room needs to exhale. Walter sat with his hands folded on the table, eyes down. When the room quieted, he looked up. "Thank you," he said. Just that. 2 words, but they carried everything. The story did not end with the gavel. Within days, people from the neighborhood had organized a work party to tend to Ruth's garden, which had been neglected during the months Walter had been displaced. Volunteers came on a Saturday morning with gloves and tools and spent 4 hours restoring what had been let go. Walter sat on the porch and watched them. Rosa brought him coffee. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. A veterans organization that had seen the story offered to repair the roof, which had developed a leak during the months the house was in legal limbo. They came the following weekend. Walter insisted on being outside the whole time, watching, occasionally offering a suggestion about where the original beams ran. He knew every inch of that house. He had built it. I received a letter from Rosa several months after the case. She wrote that Walter was doing well, that he had started teaching chess to some of the neighborhood children who came by on Saturday afternoons, that he still tended Ruth's garden every evening at 6 o'clock. She included a photograph, Walter in his garden, standing beside the roses Ruth had planted in 1964, his hand resting lightly on one of the canes that held the tallest stems upright. I kept that photograph. I want to say something to you directly before I close. There is a particular kind of love that asks for nothing in return, that gives without keeping score, that stays patient even when patience is not deserved. Most of us received that kind of love from someone early in our lives, a parent, a grandparent, someone who chose to show up for us before we had done anything to earn it. We do not always honor that love the way it deserves to be honored. Life gets busy, distance grows. We tell ourselves there is more time than there is. Walter Hayes built a house with his own hands and filled it with 60 years of living. He raised a daughter in it. He grieved his wife from it. He tended a garden in it every single evening because the garden connected him to the person he had loved longest. That is not a small life. That is a full one. He deserved to finish it in the place he built, in the home that held everything that mattered to him. He will. The law can do a great deal. It can reverse a fraudulent transfer. It can order restitution. It can refer a case to prosecutors and let consequences follow. What the law cannot do is give back the months Walter spent displaced from his own home. It cannot give back the evenings he missed in Ruth's garden. It cannot repair the thing that broke in him the morning he read that eviction notice. Some costs cannot be ordered repaid. That is why the decisions we make about the people we love matter so much. Not later, now. While there is still time to choose differently, while there is still a porch to sit on, and a phone to pick up, and a garden that needs tending, don't wait. If this story reminded you of someone you love, reach out to them today, not tomorrow, today. That is the only thing I will ask of you.